If we're going to really get a good understanding of what Jacques Lacan has in mind with his notion of the unconscious, it's going to be a good idea to set aside a series of presumptions that many people have in respect of what they take the unconscious to be. You could say, in some respects, it gets a little frustrating trying to be a Lacanian sometimes, because people bring to mind in everyday conversation about certain concepts the baggage of a whole series of, you could say, vulgar Freudian implications. So without going into a lot of detail, let's just try and make a few distinctions. Whereas for many people, and this is perhaps the inheritance of a certain type of, you could say, vulgar Freudianism, the unconscious is a kind of container of wicked impulses, of instincts. It has a kind of biologistic quality to it. By the time we get to Lacan, those ideas are rethought. Now, of course, Lacanians would say that they are rethought, reconceptualized in a way that is faithful to Freud. And I think that's important. Certainly at the beginning of his period in the 1950s of talking about the symbolic, Lacan is very clear that some of the early books that Freud spends a lot of time on, the joke book, the psychopathology of everyday life, and of course the dream book, if you read them and you are attentive to what he is doing there, Freud is highly aware of the signifier in Lacanian terms, of language, of operations of language. So I think Lacan is right to make that claim. But then we could say that instead of thinking about the unconscious as a kind of internal capacity, as a well, a kind of subterranean space that entails a whole series, like a storehouse, a kind of archive of memories and impulses, Lacan and Lacanian psychoanalysis wants to move away from that. They don't want to view the unconscious as in any way biological, as in any way a home of instincts. This is kind of completely anathema to Lacan for a number of reasons. One, of course, is that he says, and he claims that it's true of Freud as well, that the concept of instinct isn't really a psychoanalytic concept. Instinct is something that applies to the animal world. By the time we're dealing with human subjectivity, it's never merely raw instinct. It's instinct that has become and that takes on the quality of a drive. In other words, it's had some form of cultural mediation and it is no longer merely instinctual. And one of the reasons we know that is that many of our apparent human drives, whether it's to eat more, what to eat, these kinds of impulses, often take on a quality that is curved towards not what is good for us. In other words, they can no longer simply be accounted for as instinct because sometimes they take on the quality of excess, a kind of enjoyment beyond the interests of self-preservation, so on and so forth. But that's a slightly different topic. Let's just say that for Lacan, instinct is not a viable psychoanalytic concept, nor is it a concept that helps us think about human subjectivity. And if that's the case, any characterization of the unconscious as a domain of instincts is problematic. Also, the fundamental axiom for Lacan, and I put it up here on the chalkboard, is the idea that language itself is what is crucial in differentiating speaking subjects from animals. And moreover, this is my own little attempt at a formulation, you could say that language is the operating system of the unconscious. You could say, with reference to the work of someone like Lev Vygotsky, that language is the operating system for many other cognitive operations that human beings have. Again, that's the topic of another whole lecture. But Lacan is seeking to find a viable grounding for psychoanalysis that doesn't rely on what he would consider to be spurious references to biological concepts. He's looking for a basis for psychoanalytic theorizing, which is going to be able to say that many of the crucial operations of the unconscious are linguistic in nature. We've spent some time thinking about that. And that leads us to be able to make a differentiation, a series of differentiations. On the one hand, you have some psychoanalytically influenced thinkers who want to think about the unconscious as a depth psychology, as a kind of subterranean space. Lacan rejects that. The unconscious, he says, is not so much an internal space as an external set of phenomena. So that's a nice conceptual challenge for us. How do we think about the unconscious as external, as outside, rather than somehow inside? More than that, it's not just outside, it's always involving the other. Hence, Lacan's notion of the unconscious is the discourse of the other. So rather than an internal storehouse, it's an external set of linguistic practices and processes. We should also note that what that then means is we are opposed in a Lacanian frame to the depth psychology, intrapsychic notions as opposed to an attention to how language is being utilized and how the unconscious works, as it were, on the surface. So, for example, early on in Lacan's Écrit, he spends a lot of time talking about Edgar Allan Poe's story of the Purloined Letter. And again, we could spend a lot of time developing various themes there. But one of the underlying themes of that seminar and why he finds Poe's story so interesting is that part of the fulcrum of the story, one of the things that makes the story so interesting is a letter which is being hidden. And of course, the letter is being hidden in plain sight, so that when people are searching for the scandalous letter, which is supposed to contain salacious details of the activities of the Queen, the person who has the letter simply pins it on a board at home amongst a whole series of other papers. In other words, one of the implications of that is, rather than trying to always do a kind of deep diving interpretation into the depths of unintended, forgotten meanings, Lacan is saying when one is listening for signifiers, when one's listening for the unconscious, it's decidedly more on the surface. It's within the play of the signifier, of words themselves. Or back to Edgar Allan Poe, the letter, the signifier is right there. Attend to the surface. Don't be distracted by this kind of attempt to always have to go to deeper, thematic, more elusive, difficult interpretations. Let us then, having made that distinction between a whole series of stereotypical notions of what the Freudian unconscious might be and what the Lacanian unconscious is, let's try to build on that by referring to two, you could say, famous proclamations that Lacan makes. One of them is to say that what is most scandalous about the unconscious is not that there is an unconscious, or that the unconscious may have thoughts, or that the unconscious may think, that the unconscious may process, that the unconscious may end up giving a speaking voice to certain thoughts that you didn't know you had. That's not the most scandalous part of the unconscious. What's more scandalous in a way is that the unconscious is systematic, that the unconscious uses rules. It uses a kind of language. It uses displacements, condensations, or in Lacan's more linguistic terms, it uses the ongoing operation of metaphors. It uses the ongoing operation of metonymy. Or to try and put that in more straightforward terms, and I think this is a valuable way of trying to grasp this in basic, everyday, as it were, operational terms. Think about how when someone starts to speak language, that linguistic act is constantly one of potential extensions of the words, of the meanings, of the grammatical unfolding of a sentence. Okay, you could call that a horizontal or lateral level of extension. And in addition to that, there's always, you could say, the paradigmatic or the vertical series of substitutions that come when I start to speak. I'll elaborate on that a little bit more, but what I'm trying to point to here is how that language, everyday language use, brings with it a certain agency, brings with it a certain momentum, brings with it a certain insistence. So we'll come back to that, but the notion that the unconscious is scandalous precisely because it is systematic in its symbolic functioning is a nice one. It attracts us to, or it focuses us to, how we're dealing with the linguistic unconscious as opposed to a kind of depth unconscious. And we're dealing with an unconscious which has certain rules of operation, which we spent some time discussing when we thought about Freud's dream theory. Here's another nice quote, nice kind of problematizing quote. And again, with Lacan, in many instances, there's presumably a great many different ways to read this, or different possible implications of the statement. But at a certain time, Lacan says, the status of the unconscious is not ontological. The status of the unconscious is ethical. I think this is a terrific statement for many reasons. But one of the reasons that I think it's so important is that what he seems to be suggesting here is that we spend an awful lot of time trying to objectify the unconscious, to think of it as a thing, to think of it as a storehouse, an archive, a subterranean basement collection. Whereas perhaps the focus here, particularly for those of us who are interested in doing some kind of clinical work or psychoanalytic type of analysis and engagement with culture, the point is not so much to be able to do a scientific objectifying, that's it, we've done a rigorous philosophy, now we can pinpoint exactly the nature of what the unconscious is as a positive feature, as a thing, as an entity. It's not an ontological exercise as much as it is an ethical exercise. What does that mean? It means, I think, that it's less important to try to be able to definitively define and underline and compartmentalize what the unconscious might be, to scientifically verify all of that stuff. Rather, the agenda should be to, as it were, pay attention to it, to see how this dimension of human subjectivity is something which is fundamentally ethical, in the sense that one doesn't necessarily have to try to define it, but one works with it clinically as a kind of presumption, in as much as to be able to take this notion of the unconscious as an agenda to listen, to attend to the words of people who are suffering, enables us to think about how it might affect treatment. The unconscious, in other words, is a viable idea if it helps us direct clinical work, if it helps us enable a treatment. Indeed, if it helps us think about how a certain type of change might come about. And when Lacan makes that statement, then the status of the unconscious is ethical, not primarily ontological. And again, many readings could be made of it. I think that there's a kind of an oblique reference to a set of comments that Sigmund Freud makes in 1915 in his paper on the unconscious. So I'm using this book. This is just a collection of Freud's works, but the crucial reference is that 1915 paper on the unconscious. And in there, Freud says, it helps if we make something akin to a presumption, a hypothesis about the existence of the unconscious. If we do that, suddenly a whole series of phenomena, slips of speech, dreams, a whole series of such phenomena start to make a little bit more sense. Ideas that come into our head that we do not know from where, everything described as psychical symptoms. All of these acts remain, and I'm quoting him directly, disconnected and unintelligible if we insist upon claiming that every mental act that occurs in us must also be experienced in and through consciousness. It turns out that the assumption of there being an unconscious enables us to construct a successful procedure by which we can exert an effective influence upon the course of conscious processes. Just to reiterate that last part, the assumption of there being an unconscious enables us to construct a successful procedure. That, I think, is the same message that Lacan is making when he says that the unconscious is ethical, not ontological. In other words, and isn't it kind of interesting here that Freud seems somewhat modest? If we utilize the hypothesis of an unconscious, then we can start to posit certain types of explanations, and furthermore, we can construct a procedure through which to enable a kind of treatment. So if we wanted to do a kind of Lacanian thing here, we could do that, one of these Lacanian statements, and say, the unconscious does not exist. The unconscious, connoting here some kind of definitive entity. The unconscious is a noun, the unconscious is a place. That unconscious doesn't exist. What does exist, or what it does aid us to listen for, is the speech of how something, some kind of unconscious seems to speak, and how we might be able to attend to it by, in clinical work, getting a sense of what may be conveyed via different forms of language, where the subject, as it were, speaks beyond themselves.